Ellie gripped the wheel tightly as the rain hammered against the windshield of the ambulance, its wipers struggling to clear the view ahead. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling through the trees lining the narrow road. Beside her, Jack sat with his arms crossed, his usual stoic demeanor even more pronounced. They just wrapped up a grueling call, a heart attack patient in a remote cabin, and were eager to get back to the station before the storm worsened. The road ahead was empty, slick with water reflecting the harsh glow of the headlights. Thunder rumbled ominously overhead as lightning illuminated the surroundings in sudden, blinding flashes. Ellie's focus was on the treacherous road, the tires occasionally skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "This weather's ridiculous. Feels like we're driving through a disaster movie," he muttered, glancing at the GPS, still another 20 miles to go. "Great." Ellie nodded, her jaw tight. She didn't mind the rain, but the intensity of this storm was unnerving. Every flash of lightning made the darkness seem darker, and the winding road felt like it stretched endlessly. She was about to respond when something darted into the middle of the road. "Whoa!" Ellie shouted, slamming the brakes. The ambulance skidded slightly before coming to a halt. Both she and Jack lurched forward, restrained only by their seatbelts. "What the hell was that?" Jack barked, craning his neck to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. A dog. A large, shaggy dog stood in the middle of the road, drenched from the rain but oddly still. Its fur clung to its body, and its eyes gleamed in the beams of the ambulance's headlights. It didn't look scared or lost. Instead, it stared at the vehicle with an intensity that sent a shiver down Ellie's spine. "It's just a dog," Jack said dismissively, already reaching for the radio to report the delay. "It'll move if we honk. We don't have time for this." Ellie hesitated, her hands gripping the wheel. Something about the dog's behavior was strange. It wasn't pacing or barking. It just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Then it turned its head, looking off into the dark woods beside the road. "Jack, I think it wants us to follow it," Ellie said quietly, surprising herself with the thought. Jack snorted. "You've been watching too many movies. It's just a stray looking for shelter." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling. The dog had turned back to look at them, its wet tail swishing slightly before it started walking toward the edge of the road. It paused and glanced back, as if checking whether they were following. "It's trying to show us something," Ellie insisted, her voice rising slightly. Jack rolled his eyes. "Don't start. It's a dog, Ellie. A wet, stupid dog. We've got a job to do." "Jack," Ellie said firmly, already unbuckling her seatbelt. "What if someone's out there? What if it's leading us to someone who needs help?" Jack threw up his hands in frustration. "Are you serious? In this storm? We're in the middle of nowhere, Ellie. There's no one out there." But Ellie had already opened the door. The storm's ferocity hit her immediately, rain drenching her uniform as the wind tugged at her hair. She squinted against the downpour, watching the dog, which had now stopped at the edge of the woods. It barked once, sharp and clear, before disappearing into the trees. "Unbelievable," Jack muttered, grabbing his coat and reluctantly following her. "This is how people end up in horror stories." Ellie ignored him, her boots squelching in the mud as she followed the dog's path. The forest was dense, the rain barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The dog's barks echoed faintly, guiding them deeper into the woods. Jack trudged behind her, muttering under his breath about wasted time and ridiculous ideas. The mud made every step a challenge, and Ellie's flashlight barely pierced the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, both from exertion and the growing tension. She kept her eyes on the dog, which would occasionally stop and look back at them, as if ensuring they hadn't given up. "This is insane," Jack hissed, stumbling over a root. "If we die out here, I'm haunting you." Ellie didn't respond. She was too focused on the dog and the nagging feeling in her gut that they were doing the right thing. Suddenly, the dog stopped, its ears perked up. It stood still for a moment before barking sharply again, its tone urgent. Ellie quickened her pace, Jack cursing as he tried to keep up. They emerged into a small clearing, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. A car was there, half hidden by the underbrush, its front end smashed against a tree. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, and the faint sound of a car horn stuck blaring reached their ears. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered, rushing forward. Jack froze for a moment, then snapped into action, following her to the wreck. The driver's side door was open, and a man lay sprawled on the ground beside it, unconscious but breathing. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain. Ellie dropped to her knees beside him, checking his pulse. "He's alive," she called over her shoulder. Jack was already on the radio, relaying their location and requesting backup. The dog stood a few feet away, watching silently, its eyes reflecting the light from their flashlights. Ellie glanced at it, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Good dog," she murmured. As the sound of distant sirens began to pierce the storm, the dog wagged its tail once, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Ellie stared after it, a strange sense of awe washing over her. Jack shook his head as he packed up the medical kit. "Still think it's just a stray?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack didn't answer. For once, he had nothing to say. Ellie and Jack exchanged a brief glance, their faces shadowed in the weak light of their flashlights. The rain poured relentlessly, cold and heavy, soaking through their jackets as they edged closer to the ravine. Mud sucked at their boots, making every step treacherous, but they pressed on, guided by the barks and occasional whimpers of the dog. The path was uneven and slippery, branches clawing at their arms and faces as they navigated the steep descent. Jack cursed under his breath when he stumbled, nearly losing his footing. "This is insane," he spat, gripping a low-hanging branch for balance. His frustration was palpable, but Ellie barely heard him over the sound of her own labored breathing and the drumbeat of the storm. "There," Ellie pointed, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. The beam of her flashlight caught the glint of metal, a crumpled car wedged between the trees at the bottom of the ravine. Steam hissed from its battered hood, mingling with the rain in eerie wisps. Her stomach twisted at the sight. How long had it been there? And had they not come, would anyone have found it at all? As they approached, Ellie noticed the dog had stopped ahead, its drenched body trembling. It barked again, a desperate sound that cut through the storm. Ellie's heart lurched as she noticed something small and motionless just a few feet from the car. A bundle of wet fur, shivering violently against the relentless downpour. "Oh God," she breathed, hurrying forward. It was a puppy, tiny and fragile, barely clinging to life. Its breaths were shallow, its little chest rising and falling irregularly. Its fur was matted, its body so soaked that it looked impossibly small. The dog, a mother, Ellie realized, stood nearby, pacing anxiously. Its eyes were wide with desperation, flicking between Ellie and the puppy. "Ellie, don't," Jack began, but he stopped short when he saw the scene unfolding. For a moment, even he seemed at a loss for words. Ellie dropped to her knees in the mud, ignoring the cold seeping through her pants. She gently touched the puppy's head, wincing at how cold it felt. Its tiny body was limp, its legs sprawled awkwardly. "Jack," she called, her voice trembling, "we need to do something." "It's barely alive." Jack hesitated, torn between the grim reality of their situation and the sheer absurdity of trying to save a puppy in the middle of a storm. "Ellie, we have an unconscious man up there," he said, jerking his thumb toward the wreck. "We can't waste time." "It's a dog." "It's a life," Ellie shot back, her voice sharp. She wrapped her hands around the puppy carefully, shielding it from the rain as best she could. The mother dog whined softly, circling them, her wet fur brushing against Ellie's side. Jack exhaled heavily, muttering something under his breath, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he moved toward the wrecked car, aiming his flashlight inside. The windows were shattered, and the driver's seat was empty. A child's car seat was wedged awkwardly in the back, its straps hanging loose, but there was no sign of another passenger. "Ellie, come on," Jack urged, his tone clipped. "There's no one else here. Let's get back up before this whole hillside decides to give way." Ellie nodded reluctantly, cradling the puppy close to her chest. "We'll take it with us," she said firmly, daring him to argue. The mother dog barked, as if in agreement, before following closely behind them. The climb back up was grueling. The mud was slicker now, the rain pouring even harder. Ellie slipped more than once, clutching the puppy tightly to keep it from harm. Jack struggled as well, his frustration boiling over with every step. "This is ridiculous," he snapped at one point, his voice cutting through the storm. "We're EMTs, not some animal rescue squad." Ellie didn't respond. She was too focused on keeping the puppy warm, its fragile body trembling in her arms. The mother dog followed silently, her eyes never leaving Ellie's movements. By the time they reached the top, Ellie was exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. The ambulance loomed ahead, its lights cutting weakly through the rain. They hurried toward it, Jack yanking open the back doors and climbing inside to grab a thermal blanket. "Here," he said gruffly, tossing the blanket to Ellie. She wrapped the puppy in it, tucking it snugly to preserve what little warmth it had left. The mother dog tried to follow her inside, but Jack blocked the door. "No way," he said. "The dog stays out. We're not turning this rig into a kennel." Ellie glared at him, but before she could argue, the mother dog let out a sharp bark. It paced anxiously outside the ambulance, its eyes locked on the puppy in Ellie's arms. "Jack, it's freezing out there," Ellie said, her voice rising. "You can't leave her out in this storm." "Watch me," Jack retorted, slamming the door shut. "We have bigger priorities right now, like getting out of here alive." Ellie bit her lip, her frustration mounting. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The unconscious man they'd found earlier, the puppy barely clinging to life, and now this. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the blanket around the puppy, willing it to keep breathing. The radio crackled, and Jack grabbed the receiver, barking out their location to the dispatch team. "We need backup ASAP," he said. "One critical patient, vehicle wrecked off-road," and he paused, glancing at Ellie with a grimace. "And a dog situation." Ellie ignored him, focusing on the puppy in her arms. Its breathing was still uneven, its tiny body frighteningly still. She stroked its head gently, murmuring words of comfort that she wasn't even sure it could hear. The mother dog's muffled barks echoed outside, each one more desperate than the last. When Jack finished on the radio, he turned to Ellie, his expression hard. "This isn't going to end well," he said flatly. "For the dog or the puppy?" "Then we make it end well," Ellie snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "We do what we can. That's our job, isn't it?" Jack opened his mouth to argue but closed it again, his jaw tightening. Instead, he turned and started prepping the equipment they'd need for the unconscious man. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for backup. Ellie stayed by the puppy's side, her heart sinking with every shallow breath it took. The mother dog had grown quieter, its barking replaced by soft whines. It scratched at the doors occasionally, its determination unwavering despite the cold and rain. When the backup finally arrived, a second ambulance and a fire truck with a winch to recover the wrecked car, Ellie felt a surge of relief. The unconscious man was stabilized and loaded into the other ambulance, but Ellie's attention remained on the tiny bundle in her arms. "You're taking that thing with us?" one of the firefighters asked, eyeing the puppy skeptically as Ellie climbed into the back of their ambulance. "Yes," Ellie said firmly, not giving him a chance to argue. The mother dog jumped in before anyone could stop her, curling protectively beside Ellie. Jack groaned but didn't say anything, his face a mask of irritation. As the ambulance roared to life, Ellie glanced down at the puppy, her heart clenching. Its breathing was faint but steady, its tiny body finally warm against her. The mother dog rested her head on Ellie's lap, her eyes filled with gratitude. Jack muttered something under his breath, but Ellie didn't care. For the first time that night, she felt like they'd done something right, something that mattered. Ellie's arms burned as she cradled the fragile puppy against her chest, every step through the mud dragging her deeper into exhaustion. The relentless rain stung her face, her boots slipping as she struggled up the uneven slope. Jack, just ahead of her, turned to shout something over the roar of the storm, but the words were swallowed by the wind. His expression, though, was clear, frustration mixed with disbelief that they were even doing this. The mother dog was right at Ellie's side, her sodden fur plastered to her thin frame as she darted forward and back, anxiously watching every move. She barked sharply at Jack when he slipped, as though scolding him for slowing down, then turned her wide, desperate eyes back to Ellie. "Come on, Ellie." Jack yelled, his voice finally cutting through the storm as he reached the top of the ravine. He extended a hand, his flashlight swaying wildly as he fought to keep his footing. We don't have time for this. The station's still miles away, and we've got an actual human life to deal with. Ellie ignored his outburst, her focus on keeping the puppy shielded from the cold. The tiny creature was still trembling, its breaths shallow and uneven. Every time its fragile chest rose and fell, Ellie felt an almost painful relief, because there was still a chance. But it wasn't enough. They needed to get back to the ambulance. They needed heat, supplies, anything to give this little life a shot. The climb was brutal. Ellie slipped, her knee hitting the ground hard as she struggled to stay upright. Mud splattered up her arms, soaking into her sleeves and sticking to the puppy's thin blanket. The dog barked again, louder this time, circling Ellie as if urging her to get back up. Jack muttered something under his breath and stomped back down a few steps, grabbing Ellie's arm and hauling her upright. "This isn't a rescue," he snapped, his face inches from hers. "It's suicide. We're going to fall and break our necks out here, all for a puppy that probably won't make it past the hour." Ellie pulled her arm free, her glare cutting through the rain. "If you want to leave, leave," she shot back, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from the raw determination bubbling inside her. "But I'm not leaving it behind. Not now." Jack threw his hands up in exasperation but didn't argue further. Instead, he trudged ahead, his flashlight carving a shaky path through the storm. The dog followed Ellie closely, her movements quick and sure despite the slippery terrain. Every few steps, she glanced back at Ellie, her eyes filled with an almost human plea, "Hurry." When they finally reached the ambulance, Jack wrenched the back doors open and climbed in, muttering curses under his breath. Ellie hoisted herself inside, clutching the puppy tightly as the mother dog leapt in after her. Jack froze, his glare locking onto the dog as she shook herself off, spraying water everywhere. "Oh no," he barked, stepping forward. "No way is that thing coming in here. We already have one." Ellie rounded on him, her face pale but furious. "You're really going to make her stay out in this storm?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "After everything? She's not leaving her puppy. And I'm not making her." Jack opened his mouth to argue but stopped when the dog let out a low, mournful whine. She lay down on the ambulance floor, her body curled protectively around Ellie's legs. Her wet fur left a muddy trail behind her, but her eyes never left the puppy wrapped in Ellie's arms. Jack ran a hand through his rain-soaked hair and turned away, muttering, "Unbelievable." Ellie ignored him, carefully unwrapping the blanket to check on the puppy. Its tiny body was still trembling, but the shallow breaths were slower now, too slow. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind. The puppy was fading. "Jack, I need the thermal blanket from the supplies," she said urgently. "And get the heating pad going." Jack hesitated for a second, as if weighing whether to argue, but then he moved quickly, pulling open cabinets and rummaging through their gear. "You're taking this way too personally," he muttered as he handed her the blanket. "We're supposed to save people, Ellie. Not animals." Ellie didn't respond. She focused on wrapping the puppy in the blanket, layering it carefully to trap as much heat as possible. The mother dog leaned closer, her nose brushing the edge of the blanket as she sniffed her puppy, her body trembling with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She licked the puppy's face once, then looked up at Ellie with an expression that broke her heart. "Come on, little one," Ellie whispered, adjusting the heating pad beneath the blanket. She rubbed the puppy's tiny paws gently, trying to coax warmth back into its body. "Stay with me." Jack slumped into the passenger seat, shaking his head as he grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We're en route back to the station with one critical patient and additional passengers." His tone dripped with sarcasm on the last part, but Ellie didn't care. The ambulance roared to life, its tires spinning slightly in the mud before finding traction. Jack pulled back onto the road, the windshield wipers working overtime to clear the pounding rain. Ellie stayed in the back, her knees pressed against the cold floor as she monitored the puppy. The mother dog stayed close, her eyes never leaving Ellie's hands as if willing her to fix everything. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through Ellie's spine, her nerves fraying with every passing second. The puppy's breathing was still weak, its tiny body almost weightless in her hands. "Ellie," Jack called from the front, his voice unusually tense. "We're losing visibility up here. If the road floods, we're stuck." "Then drive faster," Ellie shot back, her tone cutting. She wasn't in the mood for his pessimism. Jack cursed under his breath but didn't slow down. The rain was relentless, hammering against the roof like a drumbeat of impending doom. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the ambulance swayed dangerously as the wind howled through the trees. In the back, Ellie's hands trembled as she worked. She checked the puppy's pulse again, still faint, but there. Barely. The mother dog whined softly, her head resting on Ellie's lap as if she understood the stakes. When the station finally came into view, Ellie's relief was so intense it left her lightheaded. Jack skidded to a stop in front of the garage, jumping out to wave the others over. The rain soaked him instantly, but he didn't care. He just wanted this nightmare to be over. Ellie climbed out carefully, still cradling the puppy. The mother dog jumped out after her, sticking close as they rushed inside. The warm air of the station hit them like a wave, and Ellie wasted no time setting up a makeshift station to stabilize the puppy. The other EMTs exchanged confused glances, but Ellie didn't notice or care. She worked quickly, her hands moving with a precision born of desperation. The mother dog stood beside her, her body trembling as she watched every move. Jack leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" he muttered, but there was no heat in his voice. Ellie didn't answer. She didn't have to. The puppy's faint breathing was all the answer she needed. It wasn't over, not yet. The ambulance skidded to a halt in front of the Ridgewood Wildlife Station, its engine growling as Jack threw it into park. The rain continued its relentless assault, pounding the roof of the vehicle like a furious drumbeat. Ellie didn't wait for Jack to say anything. She threw the back doors open, the icy wind biting into her skin as she climbed out, the weak puppy bundled tightly in her arms. The mother dog leapt down right after her, her soaked fur clinging to her thin frame. Her movements were frantic but purposeful, her eyes darting between Ellie and the entrance to the wildlife station. Jack trailed behind, muttering angrily as he slammed the doors shut. "This is ridiculous," Jack snapped, wiping rainwater from his face. "You dragged us out here for a dog and its half-dead pup. You know they're going to laugh at us, right? We're EMTs, not animal rescuers." Ellie shot him a glare over her shoulder, her eyes burning with defiance. "I didn't ask for your approval, Jack. Either help or stay out of the way." Jack shook his head, his jaw tightening, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he followed Ellie toward the wildlife station, muttering something under his breath about wasted time and misplaced priorities. The station's door burst open as Ellie approached, and a young woman in a Ridgewood Wildlife uniform stepped out, her face etched with confusion. "What?" she began, her words cut off as she took in the scene. The drenched EMTs, the shivering puppy wrapped in a blanket, and the anxious mother dog circling Ellie's legs. "Please, we need your help," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "The puppy's in critical condition. It needs warmth, fluids, anything you have." The wildlife worker, whose name tag read Lindsay, hesitated for only a moment before snapping into action. "Bring them inside," she said quickly, stepping aside to let them in. "We'll do what we can." The inside of the station was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. It was warm and brightly lit, the hum of heaters filling the space. Ellie hurried to the nearest table, gently setting the puppy down. The mother dog scrambled up beside it, her paws slipping on the slick surface as she leaned over her pup, whining softly. Lindsay appeared moments later with a box of medical supplies, including heat packs and syringes. "I'll grab the thermal incubator," she said, rushing off again. Jack stood off to the side, dripping water onto the tiled floor as he folded his arms. His expression was unreadable, but his tension was palpable. "You know this doesn't change anything, right?" he muttered. "If that puppy doesn't make it, this was all for nothing." Ellie ignored him, her focus entirely on the fragile life in front of her. She worked quickly, tucking heat packs around the puppy and adjusting the blanket to trap as much warmth as possible. "Come on," she whispered, stroking the pup's tiny head. You've made it this far. Don't give up now. The mother dog whined again, licking the puppy's face with quick, desperate motions. Her tail thumped anxiously against the table, her entire body trembling with worry. Ellie glanced at her and felt a lump rise in her throat. The dog's desperation mirrored her own, an unspoken bond forming between them as they fought to save the tiny life before them. Lindsay returned with the incubator, her movements swift and efficient. Here, she said, setting it up beside the table. We'll use this to regulate its body temperature. Have you checked its hydration? Not yet, Ellie admitted, her voice tight with urgency. I didn't want to move it too much. Lindsay nodded, pulling a syringe from the box. I'll take care of that. Hold it steady for me. Ellie gently lifted the puppy, cradling it in her hands as Lindsay inserted the syringe into its tiny mouth. The puppy let out a faint, pitiful whimper, its first sound since they'd found it. Ellie's heart clenched, and she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. The minutes dragged on as they worked, every second heavy with tension. The room was silent except for the steady hum of the incubator and the occasional bark from the mother dog. Jack remained by the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He looked like he wanted to say something, another sarcastic remark or a pointed observation, but for once he stayed quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the puppy's breathing began to stabilize. Its chest rose and fell with more regularity, the faint color returning to its tiny nose and paw pads. Ellie let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling as she carefully placed the puppy into the incubator. It's not out of the woods yet, Lindsay said, her voice cautious. But this is a good sign. You might have saved it. Ellie sank into a chair, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her clothes were still soaked, her hair plastered to her face, but she didn't care. Relief washed over her in waves, and she glanced at the mother dog, who was now sitting beside the incubator, her eyes locked on her pup. The dog's tail wagged weakly, a silent expression of gratitude. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his frustration barely concealed. Great, he said, his tone flat. So now what? We wait around for hours while you babysit a dog. Ellie looked up at him, her exhaustion giving way to irritation. If you're so miserable, Jack, you can leave. Nobody's stopping you. Jack scowled, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, his gaze flickering between the incubator and the mother dog. You're too soft, you know that, he muttered. This is why you get walked all over. Ellie felt the sting of his words but refused to let them show. She turned her attention back to the puppy, watching its tiny chest rise and fall. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her why she'd fought so hard to get here. Lindsay glanced between them, her brow furrowing. You two make an interesting team, she said carefully, clearly picking up on the tension. Ellie let out a dry laugh, the sound hollow. We're not a team, she said. We're just stuck in the same ambulance. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the occasional whimper from the mother dog. As the hours ticked by, the puppy's condition continued to improve. Its breathing grew stronger, its tiny limbs twitching as it stirred inside the incubator. The mother dog remained by its side the entire time, her gaze never wavering. Ellie stayed close as well, her exhaustion overshadowed by the faint, flickering hope that they'd actually done something right. Jack eventually slumped into a chair, his frustration giving way to quiet resignation. He didn't say anything, but Ellie could feel the weight of his presence, an unspoken acknowledgement that, despite his complaints, he wasn't going anywhere. By the time the rain began to let up outside, the puppy had fallen into a peaceful sleep, its body warm and steady inside the incubator. Ellie leaned back in her chair, her body aching but her heart lighter than it had been all night. The mother dog curled up at her feet, her tail wagging softly as if to say thank you. Jack finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than before. So, what's the plan now? Ellie looked at him, her exhaustion mirrored in his face. We wait, she said simply. And we hope. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable as he leaned back in his chair. For the first time all night he didn't have anything else to say. Months had passed since that stormy night, But Ellie still carried it with her, every detail etched into her memory. She thought about it during quiet moments at work, during the long drives between calls, and in the sleepless hours before dawn when guilt crept in, whispering that she could have made different choices that night. The viral story had faded from public attention, but for Ellie, it remained as vivid as ever, a defining moment she couldn't shake. It was a crisp spring afternoon when Ellie finally worked up the courage to visit the Ridgewood Wildlife Station again. The sun was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating storm that had set everything in motion. She pulled into the gravel parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She hadn't been back since the initial flurry of media attention died down. Part of her didn't want to face what she might find. What if the puppy hadn't made it? What if the mother dog, Hope, wasn't the same after everything they'd been through? She stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under her boots oddly loud in the stillness. The sanctuary building looked the same as it had months ago, a small but sturdy structure surrounded by open fields and towering trees. Ellie's heart thudded heavily in her chest as she made her way to the entrance, unsure of what to expect. The receptionist recognized her immediately, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Ellie, it's so good to see you again. You're here to see Hope and Stormy, right?" Ellie nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Yeah. How are they?" "They're amazing," the receptionist said, gesturing for Ellie to follow. "Stormy's a ball of energy now, and Hope's doing wonderfully. They've both come a long way since that night." Ellie followed her down a hallway and out onto a wide, fenced field. The sanctuary had set up a space specifically for Hope and Stormy, a lush, grassy area with plenty of room to run. The moment Ellie stepped outside, her breath caught in her chest. There they were. Stormy was unrecognizable from the tiny, trembling bundle of fur Ellie had cradled that night. He had grown into a lively, healthy puppy, his coat a glossy mix of white and brown patches. He bounded across the field with unrestrained joy, his tail wagging furiously as he chased a butterfly that danced just out of reach. Hope watched from a few feet away, her body relaxed but her eyes sharp, every inch the protective mother. She looked healthier too, her coat fuller, her posture more confident. She barked once, sharply, and Stormy came skidding to a halt, looking back at her before trotting obediently to her side. Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched them. The bond between them was unbroken, their love for each other undiminished despite everything they'd been through. Seeing them like this, alive, thriving, together, made something inside her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "They're inseparable," the receptionist said with a chuckle. "Stormy's gotten into the habit of testing his boundaries, but Hope keeps him in line. She's a good mom." Ellie nodded, her eyes never leaving the pair. "I wasn't sure if," she trailed off, unsure how to put her fears into words. "I wasn't sure if they'd be okay." "They're more than okay," the receptionist assured her. "And it's all because of you. If you hadn't stopped that night—" Ellie shook her head, cutting her off. "I almost didn't," she admitted quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I almost kept driving. Jack wanted to leave, and for a second, I thought he was right." The receptionist frowned, her expression softening. "But you didn't," she said firmly. "You stopped. And that's what matters." Ellie didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Stormy, who was now wrestling playfully with a stick he'd found, his little tail wagging so hard it made his entire body sway. Hope sat nearby, her ears twitching as she kept a watchful eye on him. Ellie's throat tightened. She thought of all the moments she'd doubted herself since that night, all the times she'd replayed the scene in her head, wondering what would have happened if she'd made a different choice. The guilt had been overwhelming at times, a constant reminder of how close she'd come to failing them. But looking at them now, she realized something she hadn't before. It wasn't just about what she'd done for them, it was about what they'd done for her. That night hadn't just saved their lives. It had renewed something in Ellie that she hadn't even realized she'd lost. 4 months, her work as an EMT had felt like an endless grind. One call after another, the same cycle of emergencies, stress, and exhaustion. She'd started to feel numb, detached, questioning whether any of it even made a difference. But Hope and Stormy had reminded her of why she'd chosen this path in the first place. They'd reminded her that every life, no matter how small, was worth fighting for. Ellie stepped closer to the fence, her hands gripping the cool metal as she crouched down. Hope's ears perked up, and for a moment, Ellie worried the dog wouldn't remember her. But then Hope rose to her feet, her tail wagging tentatively as she approached. Stormy followed close behind, his big, curious eyes fixed on Ellie. "Hey girl," Ellie said softly, her voice catching. "You remember me?" Hope sniffed the air, her head tilting slightly before she stepped closer, pressing her nose against Ellie's hand. Ellie felt her heart swell as she gently scratched behind Hope's ears, the dog's tail wagging faster in response. Stormy yipped excitedly, darting around his mother before nuzzling against Ellie's leg. Ellie laughed, the sound breaking through the lingering weight in her chest. She sat back on her heels, letting the puppy climb into her lap, his tiny paws pressing against her as he licked her face. His energy was infectious, his joy uncontainable. "You've grown so much," Ellie murmured, stroking his soft fur. "I can't believe this is the same little guy I pulled out of that ravine." Hope settled beside her, resting her head on Ellie's knee. Her eyes were calm now, free of the desperation that had haunted them that night. Ellie ran her fingers through her fur, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace for the first time in months. As Stormy wiggled in her lap, Ellie glanced down at him, then at Hope. "You saved him," she said softly, addressing the mother dog. "You didn't give up on him. Even when things were at their worst, you kept fighting." Hope's tail wagged as if she understood, her eyes meeting Ellie's with an intensity that made her breath catch. Ellie realized she wasn't just talking about Hope and Stormy. She was talking about herself too. That night had been a turning point, not just for the dogs, but for Ellie. It had reminded her of the power of compassion, of the importance of stopping, even when everything else demanded she keep moving. It had reminded her that sometimes, the smallest lives could leave the biggest impact. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ellie stayed with them, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She didn't need the viral fame or the praise people had given her. This moment, sitting here with Hope and Stormy, watching them thrive, was all the reward she needed.